Sin is not a very popular topic these days. Not quite sure exactly why that is in the first century or 21st century West, first world, but I think it has something to do with the way that probably the reign of kind of really dark notions of total depravity and the way that those kind of infected Western consciousness, and then I think there's probably in something of a revolt against that. Really, again, here we go again. Beginning with the Enlightenment. With the Enlightenment, there were a number of philosophers and theologians in the Enlightenment who wanted to affirm something of human innate goodness, and a really strong notion of original sin and of depravity. And that doesn't have to be very reformed, okay, in the terms of like coming from John Calvin and his followers, although it's strongly associated with them in contemporary thought. Really, depravity and the danger of sin has been something that all Christians have affirmed, from the very beginning of the church. Sin is a big problem, and yet at the same time, in the Enlightenment, there were as scientific methods were applied to things, it became noticed that, wow, human beings may not be actually as bad as we thought. Like, for example, if human beings are not sort of oppressed by, poverty and a lack of education, then perhaps they could be a little less, bad, awful. And it might not be that they're just evil inside, but really their circumstances and surroundings have contributed to some of their naughtiness. And I think that's sort of been developed into something like a kind of coherent kind of anti-Puritanism or something like that, where now there's almost an ideological sense of if we could just fix environments, we could somehow fix people. And because that seems to be in the air a little bit, especially in the 21st century First World West, we're embarrassed. We don't like to talk about sin because sin indicates, A, something that doesn't seem like we can fix, and B, seems to maybe focus on just one aspect of humanity, ignoring maybe something that's also there, or perhaps at least just as or more important. That said, there's also some very strong objections to classical notions of original sin, traditional views of how it came about. And I'm not here to answer those. I just want to bring them up because whether or not, and these will ultimately very strongly be drawn from your how you feel about things like evolution, human origins, because if you take evolutionary theory seriously, then some of these objections are going to become very, very pressing. But if you don't take evolutionary theory seriously, you're going to encounter in your ministry people who do, and so people who are going to find these objections extremely compelling. And so regardless of how you fall on that divide, it's very, very important for us to recognize the force of these objections and to think about what we're going to do with them. So I'm not going to offer them as the definitive, this is the way it is, but I am going to set them up for you so that you're ready to deal with them. Because I think it's important. I think it's critical as we try to do ministry to people, especially people who grow up in a post-Christian environment who are completely, they just don't know anything about the church. As a small aside, I was talking with one of my people this week, and it was interesting how the old way of doing church was the place where you form people. And so everyone in the culture is formed in the church, and then when they get to college or whatever, they kind of wander away, they try new things, and then eventually they sort of come back to church. And that's how we kind of thought about the way that church formed people, and that's a very much post-World War II way of going about things. However, in contemporary context, really it's something more like people grow up completely, almost entirely, outside of any influence of doctrine or Orthodox Christianity. They might have some, maybe, Jesus sounds like he was a good guy, I guess. Something like that, but nothing like a strong sense of the Bible or a spiritual theological framework. And then they go out, they live life, they get wrecked, they get beat up, and then they're like, boy, some religion might help make sense of all this. And then they come into the church, they come into our doors with really no preconceived notions other than I hear this is the place to get better when the world's beat you up, you know. And if that's kind of your notion of who we're going to be ministering to more and more as the West becomes increasingly post-Christian, well, be ready for these objections if you're going to promulgate a really traditional notion of original sin and depravity. First thing, if you're going to read Genesis 2-3 as in a very literal fashion, as Adam and Eve being the first immortal, eternally innocent couple from whom all human beings come, you're going to have some sort of biological concerns. You're going to have to make sense of the fact that that this couple, I guess everyone sort of interbreeds from this couple, so presumably they had a number of children, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands, and then all these children married each other. That has some problems. If you have depending on how sophisticated your notion of DNA and biology is, you have to wonder, how is that possible? So you're going to have to be able to say something like that. Moreover, if you have some concerns about that kind of historicity, you're going to very quickly have some concerns about where sin comes from. Because if you don't assume that there was, just one primordial couple, Adam and Eve, and then they sinned, and then everyone they sort of sinned on behalf of everyone, something like that. If you actually think that maybe there's a number of different kind of human beings who kind of become more and more human, and at some point there's like a community, a large group of Homo sapiens who are then mating. It's hard to see how one of those doing one thing wrong, eating from a tree, would somehow apply that wrongdoing would somehow apply to all, right? So the issue of historicity of Adam and Eve becomes very, very problematic when you're talking about original sin. On top of that, there has been a strong current in Christian tradition to think of the original sin as being somehow hereditary, right? So that, in fact, in some species of this view, it's actually the father who passes along the sin gene, if you want to call it that, and that then is a part of you from birth. In fact, this is why, on this view, Jesus is born of a virgin, right? So that rather than having the sort of sin gene passed down from Joseph, the Holy Spirit sort of intervenes so that the sin gene doesn't come in, and instead Jesus has two natures, an uncorrupted human nature and then a divine nature that are bound together. Now this also has problems in terms of atonement, because if Jesus' nature is somehow different than ours, incorrupted, then you wonder how is it that he remedies our situation, and it's a different question, but it's related, it's implicated. So presumably what would happen on like the kind of really traditional view of the Genesis account is that Adam and Eve sin, and then anyone who comes from them, which is everyone, because they're the literal first couple, then participates in this sin. It's easy to see how it is that Adam and Eve are representative of all human beings, because they pass biologically on sin to their children, grandchildren, etc. But again, if you are taking evolutionary theory seriously, it's difficult to know exactly what to make of this hereditary notion. For example, just on one point, it's difficult to know what that looks like in DNA. I mean, now we can actually look at genes, and scientists are now beginning to isolate what genes are implicated and associated with what. And so is there like an original sin gene, or is it like a cluster? It's difficult to know. But it brings up a very challenging biological question, regardless. And so some people will then want to say, well, not quite sure about this original sin thing, that it comes from these two people doing these things. The last and final issue is that if sin is somehow hereditary, and if it is something that each person deals with, sin is primarily an individual problem, right? Sin is something that I deal with because I have a corrupted nature, okay? And so the primary issue is how does Tom get fixed, right? But this is problematic, not from a biological standpoint, but actually from a biblical standpoint. Because it seems that when Paul talks about sin in the New Testament, he tends to be thinking of something that's altogether more demonic, for lack of a better word, corporate, indicating that it corrupts institutions and groups of people, and that it has power of its own. So, for example, in Romans 5, some translations of that will actually capitalize the word sin, because it sounds as if Paul is talking about sin as having power. He even uses verbs of sin does things, right? Sin's like this power that kills, essentially. And it seems like sin has more agency in Paul than something that just comes from just Tom. It seems to be bigger than Tom. In fact, Paul speaks of it as enslaving me, as ruling over me, something from which I need to be freed. Moreover, anytime you hear talk of the powers in the New Testament, it appears that there are forces that are not individual human agents that are responsible for corrupting or influencing human beings. And so it looks as if the problem of sin is not entirely internal in the Scriptures. In fact, it looks like it's something that's way bigger than that. And we get this also in the Old Testament. It's not just a New Testament thing, but also if you look at the Old Testament laws, they're very much concerned with communities and the way that sin rubs off. Not so much the way that sin is a manifestation of rule breaking. This is one way that it's hard for Westerners to kind of get our minds a lot of times around some of the Levitical laws of purity, because we don't think of sin as being a matter of impurity so much as we think of it as being a matter of infractions. But infractions are not what's at stake when something that's unholy can literally be passed on by physical touch, right? That's one of the problems with blood in the Old Testament and interacting with things that are ritually impure, because it rubs off on you and you can literally pass it on just by touching somebody else. That does not at all sound like an issue of rule breaking or infractions. That sounds like something that's much larger, much more communal, and much less about rules, like moral rules, I guess, that we somehow break. So those objections are going to come if you embrace a traditional notion of original sin and depravity. I'm not sure what to say about that, only that however you view evolutionary theory and however you begin and continue reading the Old and New Testament with respect to sin, you've got to be able to deal with these things. You have to have an answer for it. Because it's going to come up. All that said, when we talk about original sin, the danger is that people want to update our notions of sin, and they want to say, oh well, we want to take into account findings in the natural sciences and blah blah blah, and then at the end of the day, they come up with some watered down, weak notion of sin, that sin just doesn't actually sound like it's that big a deal. It seems like a lot of times we use these arguments and findings in the sciences or whatever to get away from a really strong, compelling, commanding notion of sin, which is absolutely ridiculous. Because if there's one thing, I think Niebuhr at one point said something like, original sin is like the most well-attested thing we've in all of the universe. If there's one thing we know about human beings, it's they are sinful. And even if we want to invoke, the notion of sins as powers of demonic forces, even if we want to invoke a more communal notion and get away from just an individual account of sin, what that ought to be doing for us is it ought to be making sin out to be as big a problem as Paul thinks it is. Paul thinks that sin is the problem, that death is the problem. Sin is so pervasive, so all-encompassing, so enslaving and corrupting and malignant that only the most radical movement from God is going to be able to fix it. We do not, whatever we do, we do not want to get into a kind of therapeutic view of Christian life, that people are basically okay, and with just a little bit of a push here and a little bit of a push there, that they're going to be fine. That is nowhere in Scripture. And no amount of the natural sciences and no amount of biblical study is going to do anything other than push against that notion. We absolutely must be united as Christians in a conviction that sin is universal. It is malignant. It is corrupt. It is corrupting. It is a powerful, influential force. It comes from us. It comes from outside of us. It's infecting our communities. It's above us in institutions. And it is bad. It is so bad that it absolutely must be stopped. Notice that when you talk about atonement, and we're not talking about this week, but we will have to, when you're talking about atonement, if you have a really big, really deep, non-therapeutic notion of sin, then you have got to have a really big, really deep, really powerful notion of atonement. The issue is not merely that you're forgiven. Forgiveness is important. It's a first step. And it's something that we claim that we have through the cross and through God's gracious invitation, but it is not the end of the cross. It is not the point of the cross. No, God is on a sin-fixing mission. And so whatever we say about atonement, we have to take into account that God's purposes in the cross are to thwart, subvert, defang, and do away with sin, to fix the things that sin has corrupted and twisted, and to prevent more of that going on. Our account of the cross and of the redemption that's available through Christ has to be cosmic. It has to talk about fixing people, fixing communities, fixing institutions, and yes, fixing the world. Whatever you do with those objections to sin, I would suggest that we would be best suited not focusing so much on origins of sin, instead focused more on solutions to sin, and to get a big enough, robust enough, deep enough, cosmic enough notion or view or concept of the cross of Christ and the new birth that we have in his blood to be able to articulate how it is that God is fixing the sin problem in and through us, in and through the church.